Alright, this is the final video in this series. I'm going to probably do one more wrap-up video, just show you some of the buckets that I've made, maybe show you a tractor in action, these really cool flotation wheels that I ended up building. But if you want the better video for rebuilding this tractor, you're going to want to check out Matt's shop. I'll put the link in the description. He does a full refurbishing of one of these tractors. That's where I got all my information from. This is just sort of a complimentary video to that. But you might see some stuff in here that you didn't see in his videos. So we'll just kind of get into this. And at the end of this, it's going to be a bit of a slideshow. I got a little bit overwhelmed in making this. There was a lot of B-roll to process. But I'll just show you kind of some part numbers. These are the cylinder sleeve seals. And I used the puller for removing these in reverse. Just made a little bit of a different sort of guide on the top there to keep it in place, and then you just pull these back in, use some soapy water, and it just goes in really pretty slick, pretty easy to do. This is the inside, just kind of showing you what that looks like there. And I never ended up pulling the cam out. So unfortunately, I don't have any information on that in this series. Right here, I'm pounding in the main. you know, so you put these bearings in the freezer, and you try to put a little bit of heat to the case to shrink the bearing and open up the case a little bit. It's typically what you want to do. These still ended up fighting me quite a bit to get in there. You can see that thrust washer we got there. Those things are a little bit of a pain, you're going to find. You want to use some assembly lube or some grease to hold those in place. I didn't really put any of that in the video. Make sure also before putting those in to line that oil port there with the passageway on the case. You don't want to have, to be putting these in twice or a real headache. So, I just put those bearings in the freezer for a few hours. The steel hammer always works better, but it's not the first choice. You're going to end up mushrooming your sockets, and if you can avoid using them. But the clearance was just so tight, which makes sense. You want them to be right. You don't want that bearing spinning. Yeah, that's me. Same with the seals. I shrink the seals, try to heat up the case even to get those clearances a little bit easier for installation. Thrust bearing going on the inside of there. It's got alignment, little tabs on it. Spraying some assembly lube there on the crank, putting that in, and then putting that back cover on. And that back cover is an absolute pain in the butt because that thrust washer just keeps one, or spacer or whatever you would call it, just keeps wanting to fall out. And then checking that it rotates very nicely and smooth. Now, if you've got you want to check that before you take that apart too, because if you got a bent crank or something like that, it's gonna have a lot of nastiness. It's got a binding and whatnot, so that's got to spin really freely and easily. Otherwise, you got a bent crank, and you're putting this back together with a bent crank, you're just gonna end up having to pull it apart again. So what was I doing there? I was using socket. So I use my impact to tighten those down, and my impact's got different settings. So I just start on the lowest, work my way up, and then go with the torque wrench. I don't have the torque settings for you. This was the alignment marks. And again, as I mentioned in that previous video about doing helical gears, it's really tricky to line those up because they're not where they are in their final position. So you got to kind of like gauge it a little bit, try one tooth, see if it's in the right spot, try another tooth, see if it's in the right spot. That zero, yeah, I didn't really get a good shot of that, but that zero, there's 3 zeros. That zero's got to line up just on the edge of the 2 zeros on the governor sprocket there. I guess that's the cam sprocket, I think. Pounding that little keyway back in. There's a metric tech screw, I guess, insert for pulling those out, and just used it for pounding it back in as well. Goes in pretty easy, pretty nice. Didn't really need to freeze that or nothing, but probably would have made it a little easier. Putting it back on my engine stand, and then getting ready to do pistons. So pulling those piston pins out, pounding them out, and the new, what was it? The new piston connecting rod bushings, I think it was. Those were kind of real pain to get in because they had, for whatever reason, they weren't like solid. They had a little bit of a seam in them. So those are other things that you're definitely going to want to heat up those connecting rods and freeze those bushings for inserting them and finding the right socket, pound them in. So I'm getting the pistons ready here, making sure everything's to spec. You definitely need to check that stuff. A lot of times you just get sent the wrong stuff. Somebody grabs the wrong box. Maybe even it's just out of spec from the factory. So I'm pounding those out, pounding the new ones in, and making sure everything's the same, lining those oil ports up. Very important. Now, right now, excuse me, I'm checking the head for flatness. If this was not flat, there's a gauge there. I don't know what the specification is that. Matt has that in his video because his head was not to spec. So you can send this off to a machine shop. Or if you got a lot of time, you can see in his video, time and patience. He takes, I think, a pane of glass. Maybe that was from like a glass coffee table. And then he puts, tapes some sandpaper down to it. And then he just slides the head back and forth on that and try to get a little bit flatter so it's to spec. I think it worked for him, so that's a cool trick. And then these are brass bushings, so they're you want to be careful with them. You don't want to be pounding directly on them with a hammer. You're going to ruin them. I'm just aligning it, and it's got that stupid seam in it that makes it want to like twist, kind of weird. I actually managed to get it with my dead blow there. There are these hammers nowadays. They look like a dead blow, but they're just a rubber hammer. Don't get tricked into buying those. You want a proper dead blow hammer with shot inside of it. It's not the same thing as what those other hammers that are trying to imitate them are. Yeah, it's just cool little rags. I laugh every time I see some of these interesting rags that I come across. Assembly lube. Unfortunately, I didn't have proper assembly lube, and the store was closed when I was doing this. I kind of was a little bit unprepared. I thought I had assembly lube, but turns out I didn't. So there's different kinds you have of piston rings here. You've got your scraper, and then I think there's three of the other rings. They go in a certain way. Make sure you put them in properly, and then you offset your gaps by about 30 degrees. And they come in the package. I believe they came, at least for me, they came in the package the way that they're supposed to go on. Make sure that they are facing the right way, like up and down, and that also they're in the right order. I should have, probably done a better job of recording that to show you which way they go. But put them just, you're probably safe bet. Just put them in the same exact way, up, like flipped upside down, all that, as they come in the package. So that right there, I was kind of showing you putting the. I screwed up here, so hold on. Let's talk a little bit about this. So this that governor linkage there, you're going to see in a second here. I ended up having to pull all of this back apart because I didn't have that in right. And then I got it fully assembled, and then I ended up having to pull that cover off like 3 times. So what you're going to need to actually do, and I ended up even bending the governor tabs a little bit, and I had to straighten those, and it just ended up being an absolute nightmare. I lost about a half a day, probably like 4 or 5 hours, just screwing around with this stupid case. And I think it was mostly all because I forgot about this stupid little bolt that you're going to see in a second here. So yeah, I'm just aligning stuff, I'm putting that on, and there's that hole on the top left there where there's supposed to be the adjustment dowel for that governor linkage, and that's got to come out of there. And you can see it's not coming out of there. So I'm just wasting, I'm wasting time here. God, it hurts my soul to watch me do this without having that in there. Putting it all together, and then it's going to come all the way back apart. And every time I put it back on, I thought I had it, and then I ended up having the weights in the wrong position. That was one of the reasons I had to pull the cover back off again. So when I actually had the adjustment dowel coming through that port, then I ended up having the weights on the linkage not in properly. And then this stupid thing, the hydraulic pump with those forks that need to line up into its corresponding gear in the inside there. And I probably could have made my life a little bit easier by just taking that hydraulic pump off. So don't try and install the cover with that hydraulic pump on there. Just have that removed. But I'm using a little bit of sealant in there, just gasket maker. It can go two different ways, so make sure, I believe that the big port is up. Now here's where I'm mad at myself. I didn't have that stupid dowel through that hole there. So there's the little spring-loaded guide there that holds that linkage in place. You want that in beforehand, and then you can put the linkage on it, right? That linkage has to be hooked up to that spring beforehand. That's another reason I had to pull it back apart again. So the spring has to be connected to the linkage beforehand, and that dowel has to be connected to the case beforehand, and then you put those together while you're pushing that on, and take the hydraulic pump back off. I should have done that. It just makes life so much more difficult. But nevertheless, I ended up getting it done. And now that everything's in there properly, I'm adjusting it forward, and you can see it's all connected in there. It goes on. I'm showing you what side of the spring it goes on. It goes, right, so you can see the spring is left of the linkage. Don't try to put the spring inside that linkage. I'm putting I think that's the tachometer cable back on. Putting pistons in now. And you'll see I found this, putting some assembly lube on everything, especially these bearings. Put a little bit of assembly lube on this piston ring compressor. Man, I love that piston ring compressor. It looked like such a cheap piece of crap, but the guy at the parts store, this old timer, he's like, hey, you're gonna like these. They work way better, and they sure do. There are a little bit of alignment tabs on these connecting rod caps. So make sure that everything is put back together exactly in orientation and everything the same way that you took it apart. Make sure everything was marked properly when you took it apart. I'm a head gasket here. And I'm not like a professional engine rebuilder. Like, maybe I'm probably doing stuff wrong here. So do more research before doing this. Check out some engine rebuild videos to learn about rebuilding engines. This is just to the best of my knowledge. Again, I'm putting everything on the lowest setting with my impact. I go around, I turn it up a bit, I go around again, I turn it up a bit, and then here is the torque specs, right? So it says increments of 1/3 of the max torque And then on some of these heads, you go like you need like a dial indicator. That was not the case on this one, but you go like to the max torque spec and then you go 90 degrees past that. That was not the case here. And then I'm putting the rockers back on. And, I probably should have got new springs, new valves, all that. These springs are weak. That could be a part of the reason. Maybe I'm still getting a tiny little bit of knock. And, uh, I'm not really, but just on startup. I'm pretty sure it's just the injectors. Assembly lube on those push rods there. Yeah, those springs are super weak. I'm gonna end up needing to buy a whole new head pretty soon here. So here is the valve clearances, and then after you run this for a little bit, you're gonna want to reset your valve clearances again. That's something I'm gonna need to be doing pretty soon here myself. I honestly haven't run this too terribly much. And then the conversion, if you got metric shims, you're gonna need to convert that. And then there's a mark uh, on your gear here that shows you top dead center. So again, watch Matt's video. I can't remember exactly what that was, but you want to put that top dead center. You can also check through your see here. You won't be able to check through the injector ports because it's got those little those weird little things in there. Cranking it over a little bit, checking the others. Maybe that's what it was. One of those marks is for one top dead center, and the other mark is for the other top dead center. I can't exactly remember, but it's easy enough information to find. Make sure everything rotates nicely. There's no binding. Everything's working properly. It's all cleaned very well. Can't use enough assembly lube. And then I'm cleaning this old gasket off of the valve cover. That thing was absolute. That was like almost. I don't know how they bonded that to that, but that was a nightmare to get off there. So I'm using this wire wheel, and if you got an electric die grinder, then if you want one. They're pretty OP. Putting that valve cover back on. And then here's the slideshow portion of this. So I've just got some more information. That is, don't use these Fram oil filters. That's just the code for it. You can cross-reference and find the proper one. Let's actually have a little bit of a look at that there. That was a picture. So I'm not sure if this was just a casting blemish or if that was a little bit of a crack starting from the head. If it was a little bit of a crack actually starting in the head, then I should have, or I may end up having to, come back with a little bit of a nickel rod and doing the whole process for welding that up. I'm hoping that doesn't end up being the case. I think it was just a casting blemish though. So I just put a little bit of JB Weld in there just to, just seal it up. And, I don't know. Just trying to do my due diligence, right? There's only so much time and money I have to put into this, and I'm pretty sure it was probably just a casting blemish. So again, there's a picture of how that's supposed to look in there. That's got to sit on the inside of that little retainer there. And then this is the linkage going over to the fuel pump. And there's a whole thing that you need to do when it comes to the fuel pump with the shims for that sets how long the fuel pump stays open, how much fuel it pumps, and then also adjusting where the governor linkage sits on the fuel pump. There's a whole process to that. This is not the video for that. Check out Matt's shop. He's got a really good explanation for that. But there is a little dowel that linkage needs to sit on. My fuel lines, as I mentioned before, this sat for so long that diesel fuel turned into this black sludge that I'm still working on cleaning out of these fuel lines. I got a bunch of fuel injector cleaner that I'm constantly running through the system, and I did my best to clean out these fuel lines. They were plugged solid, so I run a little bit of hard wire, welding wire through there. Luckily, it wasn't too bad. I was able to get some of that out of there. Running some WD through it and blowing air through it. I probably should have put some heat to it maybe. What do we got going on here? So I just took some more pictures, just kind of like of what the fuel lines look like, how the orientation was. I think all that was. There's the pyrometer, I believe. You can see what hole the alternator linkage goes into, how those fuel lines sit in their little guide. More alternator bracket tree, alternator pulley shroud. You know how the alternator sits on there. I think for some reason I had a little bit of trouble with that. Not sure why. I don't exactly remember, but there's the belt. You can cross-reference that number. Should be able to give you a size there. I think A37 is the size. There's something I'm pointing at there. There's something about this shroud I don't exactly remember, but like I say, you'll figure it out. If you know, you know. So just made sure that was cleaned up really well. There is the oil pickup. Oh, those holes you want up. That's what I took a picture of that. Those you don't want that sucking that sludge off the bottom there. And then there's two different size bolts for the oil pan. The ones on the corner, I believe, are different size. There's a little trick we'll talk about, and you'll find this really through anything. When you're trying to figure out what bolts go where, just put them in to the slot, to the hole. Don't thread them in at all. Just put all the bolts in, and they should all be sticking out about the same amount of distance, usually about a ½ inch. And then you can start screwing them all in and torquing them down. There's the oil filter housing. There's the guide for the radiator. And my injectors. Had to get new line for the return on the injectors. Honestly, I don't even have that line on. It doesn't really return much fluid. Okay, and I ended up having pretty much everybody ends up having a broken bolt on this exhaust manifold. So I'm using a stick welder with a 60 series. I'm not sure. Maybe it's a 7018. Yeah, it probably was because I wanted something a little bit harder for extracting that bolt. Put a nut on it, weld it down. That's definitely 70 series. And then just use a lot of percussion maintenance. Go real easy, back and forth. Don't get crazy. If it's hard to turn when you're trying to take one of these C's bolts out, you're just going to snap it again. So just back and forth, back and forth. Lots of really light percussion. Heat stuff up, cool stuff down. Just keep shocking it, shocking it, shocking it, and eventually it'll come out. Very light movements. Putting that back on there using anti-seize. Lots of anti-seize on the stems and everything. Oh, and here's that black sludge. I just gave up on this tank, so I just used a jerry can because it was about the same size, and just made some modifications to the bottom of it. This was my hydraulic fluid, and if you know about having water contamination in your hydraulic fluid, you have to clean the entire system. You got to pull all the lines off, blow them out, drain everything, clean the case out by hand, pull all of the rams off, cycle the rams, get all that fluid out of there, because even the tiniest little bit of contamination is going to keep your hydraulic fluid looking milky and give you bubbling. So just an absolute headache. And that was just from it sitting.